Every home has its own sounds, the creak of settling wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft shuffle of fabric as someone moves in bed. Most of these sounds can be explained. But some are different. Some whisper when no one is there. Some echo footsteps that belong to no living soul. Some remind you that you are never truly alone. For David and Claire Whitmore, a middle-class couple living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, their home was their sanctuary. Until, one day, the sounds changed. Until, one day, the house refused to be silent. What started as a faint unease would soon unravel into an unimaginable terror, one they would have no escape from. David woke first. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 3:14 a.m., that eerie, in-between hour when the world is neither fully asleep nor awake. The air felt dense, as if the room had shrunk around him. A whisper of breath, too quiet to belong to Claire, brushed against his ear. He froze. The breath came again. Soft. Shallow. Inhalation, pause, exhalation. Someone was in the room. His eyes darted toward Claire, who lay undisturbed beside him. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward the bedroom door. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but there was movement, an absence of light shifting in the void. A shape. David's chest tightened. His brain scrambled for logic. The heating vent. A draft? His own breath rebounding off the sheets. But the sound was too close, right beside his ear. He forced himself to sit up. His fingers tightened into the sheets. The darkness did not retreat. Then, click. The closet door, which had been firmly shut when they went to bed, drifted open an inch. A cold, electric terror spiked through David's spine. He reached for the bedside lamp, but as his fingers brushed the switch, the door slammed shut. Claire jolted awake. What was that? David's voice was hoarse. I don't know. His heart pounded so hard it echoed in his skull. He wanted to dismiss it. He wanted to tell Claire it was nothing. But deep down, he knew, something was in the room with them. Claire sat up, rubbing her eyes. What do you mean you don't know? David swallowed hard. His gaze flicked between her and the closet door. It just opened. Then it slammed shut. Claire squinted at the door. Wind from the window. David shook his head. The windows are closed. Silence stretched between them. The air was unnaturally still. The kind of silence that felt alive, watching. David swung his legs over the bed and stood up. His bare feet pressed into the cold wooden floor. The closet stood just a few feet away, its white door closed as if it had never moved. He hesitated, then reached out. His hand trembled slightly as he grasped the handle. A pause. Then, he pulled. The door glided open effortlessly, revealing a row of hanging clothes swaying gently, though there was no draft. He squinted into the darkness, half expecting something to stare back. Nothing. Claire exhaled. Jesus, Dave, you scared me. David let out a shaky chuckle. Yeah. Must have been. I don't know. Maybe the house settling. The lie tasted stale on his tongue. He left the closet open and climbed back into bed. Claire curled up beside him, already half asleep again. David didn't sleep. Because just as his eyes drifted closed, he heard it again, that breath. And this time, it was coming from inside the closet. The next morning, David forced himself to shake off the lingering unease. Claire seemed to have already forgotten about the night before, humming as she brewed coffee. But something felt off. David couldn't place it at first. The house looked the same, smelled the same. Yet, beneath the normalcy, a foreign presence slithered through the walls. Then he noticed it. The hallway leading to the bedroom, longer than usual. It stretched just a few feet too far. As if the house had subtly warped overnight. The closet door stood slightly ajar, despite him remembering closing it that morning. A faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. David's breath hitched. "Claire," he called, voice tight. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand. "What's up?" He hesitated. Did the hallway always look this long to you?" Claire frowned. "What?" She glanced down the hall. "Looks the same as always." David blinked. The distortion was gone. The hall was back to normal. His stomach twisted. "Never mind," he muttered. "Didn't sleep well." Claire gave him a sympathetic look. "Maybe you just need some air." Maybe. Or maybe something in the house was shifting. Watching. Waiting. By the time night fell, David had almost convinced himself he was imagining things. Almost. He and Claire settled into their usual routine, dinner, a bit of television, and then bed. Claire was asleep within minutes. But David lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. The house was not silent. It was breathing. Not in an obvious way. Not in the way a person breathes. But there was movement, a slow, rhythmic shift in the air, as if the walls themselves inhaled and exhaled. And then, the whispering began. Faint. Just at the edge of perception. David strained to listen. The words were indistinct. A murmur threading through the darkness. It sounded like someone standing at the far end of the hallway, speaking just softly enough that he couldn't make out what they were saying. A chill crawled over his skin. Slowly, he turned his head toward the bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black. But something was standing there. A silhouette. Tall. Thin. Motionless. A ragged breath rasped through the air, not his own. David's muscles locked. His throat tightened. He tried to reach for Claire, but his body refused to move. The figure did not advance. Did not retreat. It simply stood there, breathing in unison with the house. Then, the door began to close. Not a sudden slam. A slow, deliberate movement. David watched, helpless. As the darkness swallowed the last sliver of light from the hall. Click. The door shut completely. And the whispering stopped. The next morning, David barely touched his coffee. Claire noticed. "You look like hell," she said. "Did you sleep at all?" David shook his head. "No. Weird dreams." It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. Claire leaned against the counter, studying him. "Maybe it's stress. You've been off all week." David forced a smile. "Yeah. Probably just work stuff." He didn't want to say it. Didn't want to admit that every fiber of his being was screaming that something was terribly wrong. The bathroom mirror caught his eye. For a moment. Just a flicker, his reflection didn't move in sync with him. He barely had time to process it before Claire spoke again. "Why don't you take the day off? Clear your head." David nodded slowly. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was just overtired. But as he turned away from the mirror, he could have sworn he saw his reflection smiling. And he hadn't been. David spent the day trying to distract himself, ran errands, went for a drive, anything to stay out of the house. But as evening crept in, he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. When he stepped inside, the air felt heavier than usual. Claire was in the living room, scrolling on her phone. "Hey," she said without looking up. David forced a casual tone. "Hey. How was your day?" She shrugged. "Fine." "Oh," she gestured toward the hallway, "I think the basement door is messed up." It was open when I got home. Wouldn't stay shut. David frowned. The basement door. His stomach turned. They rarely went down there. Just storage. He walked to the hallway. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. A slow, sickening dread coiled in his gut. He reached for the knob. As soon as his fingers touched it, something knocked from the other side. Not a polite knock. A single, heavy pound. David's breath caught. He stepped back. Then, from deep in the basement, a voice called out. It was Claire's voice. "David? Can you come down here?" His blood ran ice cold. Because Claire was still sitting in the living room. And she was staring at him in confusion. David's breath hitched. His entire body went rigid. The voice from the basement called again, clearer this time. "David, come down here." It sounded exactly like Claire. But softer. Wrong. He turned his head toward the living room. Claire was still sitting on the couch, her phone in her lap, her face pale. "What was that?" she whispered. David shook his head slowly. His mind raced through possibilities, an echo, a prank, a rational explanation. But deep down, he already knew, that was not Claire. A slow, heavy thud echoed from the basement. Then another. Footsteps. Coming up the stairs. David grabbed Claire's wrist and yanked her off the couch. "Get outside. Now." Claire hesitated for only a second before the urgency in his voice registered. She bolted toward the front door, David right behind her. Just as they reached the threshold, the basement door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Silence. David's pulse thundered in his ears. He turned the deadbolt and yanked the front door open, pulling Claire onto the porch. The cool night air rushed over them. They stood there, staring at the house. Breathless. The basement door hadn't just shut. It had locked itself. They spent the night at a hotel. Claire wanted to call the police, but what would they even say? Someone imitated my voice in the basement. By morning, David felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. Rationality clawed its way back into his thoughts. Maybe there had been an intruder. Maybe someone had broken in, though that didn't explain the voice. They returned home just after sunrise. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The basement door was still shut. David approached it cautiously, gripping a flashlight in one hand. Claire hovered behind him, clutching her phone, ready to call for help. He reached for the knob. It turned too easily. The door swung open. The basement was empty. No footprints in the dust. No signs of forced entry. Just stairs leading down into shadows. A shape moved at the edge of his vision. David whipped the flashlight toward the far corner. Nothing. Then, just as he exhaled, the whispering returned. Right behind him. "David." The light flickered. Claire screamed. David spun. His pulse hammering. The basement door slammed shut between them. He was locked inside. David pounded on the door. "Claire. Open it." On the other side, she fumbled with the knob. "It won't, David. It won't open." The basement groaned. The air thickened, pressing in from all sides. Then, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the far end of the basement. David turned, raising the flashlight. A figure stood just beyond the beam's reach. And it looked exactly like him. Same height. Same clothes. Same face. But it was smiling. David's breath hitched. The other him tilted its head. "You don't belong here anymore." The flashlight flickered, the bulb whining under pressure. The thing took a step forward. Then another. David scrambled backward, slamming against the door. Claire. The bulb shattered. Darkness swallowed him whole. Claire finally managed to force the basement door open. She stumbled back as David rushed out, slamming it shut behind him. He was pale, shaking, drenched in sweat. Jesus, David, what? I don't want to talk about it, he snapped. His voice was tight, raw. Claire hesitated. Something about him seemed off. His posture. His eyes. His silence. That night, as they lay in bed, Claire couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt him staring at her. And when she finally turned over, David was awake. Lying perfectly still. Eyes wide open. Smiling. Claire's stomach clenched. David wasn't just awake, he was watching her. His lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile, too wide to be natural. The whites of his eyes gleamed in the darkness. David, she whispered. Silence. He didn't blink. Her pulse pounded. Something was wrong. So very wrong. She reached out hesitantly. Fingers brushing against his arm. His skin was ice cold. Claire yanked her hand back, breath catching in her throat. David's smile widened. Go to sleep, Claire. His voice was familiar. But underneath it, beneath the tone she had heard every day for years, there was something else. An echo. A distortion. Claire's breath shuddered. She slid out of bed slowly, keeping her eyes locked on him. He didn't move. She forced herself to turn away, step by step, until she reached the hallway. Her hand gripped the doorframe as she turned for one last glance. David was still staring. Still smiling. But now, he was sitting up. She ran. Claire locked herself in the bathroom, heart racing. What the hell was happening? She pressed her ear against the door, listening. The house was silent. Then. Knock. 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 Claire. David's voice. Right outside. Open the door. She clapped a hand over her mouth, biting back a sob. Something deep in her gut screamed, do not let him in. The doorknob twisted. Claire, open up. The voice was wrong. The knocks came again. Harder this time. Then. From somewhere else in the house, a sound. A low, hoarse groan. Claire froze. It was coming from the basement. And it sounded like David. Her stomach twisted violently. No. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She typed a single message and sent it to David's number. Where are you? For a long, agonizing moment, there was no reply. Then, her phone buzzed. A single text appeared. Basement. Don't trust him. Her breath caught. She stared at the screen, nausea rising in her throat. If David was texting her from the basement, who was outside the door? The knocking stopped. Silence pressed against the walls. Claire's pulse throbbed in her ears. Then. Scratch. 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 Slow, deliberate fingernails dragging down the wood. She choked back a cry. Claire, the thing whispered. Let me in. The voice was losing its human quality. A hint of something deeper, something primal, slithered beneath it. She didn't move. Didn't breathe. The scratching stopped. Then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Walking away. The air thickened, pressing in around her. The house felt alive, waiting. Claire's hands shook as she unlocked the bathroom door and eased it open. The hallway was empty. But she knew it was still here. Watching. She had to get to David. The real one. Claire crept through the house, every shadow a threat. The basement door loomed at the end of the hallway, wide open. Blackness yawned beyond the threshold. A single whisper drifted up the stairs. Claire. She swallowed hard. Go. Now. Her bare feet touched the first step. The wood groaned beneath her weight. The air grew colder with every step down. By the time she reached the bottom, her breath misted in front of her. David sat against the far wall, pale, shaking, his wrists bruised as if he had been grabbing at something in the dark. His wide, frantic eyes locked onto hers. Claire, he rasped. That thing, it's not me. It's not me. She rushed to him, dropping to her knees. His skin was warm. Beating. Alive. But upstairs, it was moving. Heavy. Deliberate footsteps began to descend the stairs. Claire and David turned, dread clawing up their spines. A shadow stretched down the steps before the figure came into view. Another David. But this one was wrong. Its arms were too long. Its head tilted too far. And its face, David's face, was frozen in a grotesque, unnatural smile. It crawled the rest of the way down, joints popping. Limbs bending unnaturally. Claire clutched David's arm. That's not you, she whispered. David's breath shuddered. No. It's not. The thing grinned wider. Only one of us gets to leave. Then it lunged. Claire screamed as the thing crashed toward them. David shoved her out of the way just as it tackled him, dragging him to the floor. The basement trembled, walls groaning. The air pulsing with something inhuman. David gasped as the thing clawed at his skin, gripping his throat. It was stealing him. Its body convulsed, its features warping, shifting. As if trying to overwrite David's existence. Claire grabbed the flashlight from the floor. With a desperate cry, she swung it with all her strength, smashing it into the thing's head. It shrieked. David tore free, gasping. The thing lurched back, its form flickering, shifting between David's shape and something far, far worse. The walls shook. The house screamed. And then, the basement door slammed shut. The thing was gone. The silence was deafening. Claire and David sat there, gasping for breath. Finally, Claire whispered, "Is it over?" David's hand tightened around hers. A long silence. Then, he smiled. And Claire felt ice crawl down her spine. Because David never smiled like that. A week passed. David was fine. Or at least. That's what Claire kept telling herself. He acted normal. Spoke like David. Moved like David. But sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he smiled. Too wide. Too still. And every night, just as Claire was drifting to sleep, she would hear the basement door creak open. And something whisper her name.